Hello, and welcome to episode 23 of the Arrow Digital Hotel podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Lucy Gaffney to the podcast. Hello, Lucy. How are you?
Good morning, Richard. I'm very well, thank you.
Good, good. Well, thank you for joining us. I just want to give our listeners an introduction to you first, give you an idea of your credentials that we're going to be talking about biodiversity today. So, Lucy is the Executive Director at Business for Biodiversity Ireland, which is an initiative funded by the Irish government, and the aim is to engage with businesses and support them to make a positive impact on nature. I'm actually taking this now from your LinkedIn bio. So, you sit on the advisory board for the European Business and Biodiversity Platform, the impact board of the Go Nature Positive initiative, and you join in the working group for the Nature Finance Roadmap for Ireland and the steering committee of Peatlands Finance Ireland. And you're passionate, it says here, about bridging the gap between science and business and empowering companies to take action for nature. Would that be a fair assessment, Lucy?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote that myself. So
Yeah, well,
there's no
no
lies
better
in there,
person
Richard.
to write it.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, I think you are definitely the right person to be talking about biodiversity for business. And it's great to have an expert on the podcast. So, as I say, thank you for joining us. So, this comes about because heading down the line towards us is something which I didn't know anything about until approximately 3 weeks ago. And which I guess businesses may not know about. And you are here to appraise us of the upcoming EU directives based around corporate sustainability reporting directive, Lucy. So,
Hmm.
first of all, um, what are these new directives that are coming for businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Richard. I think perhaps the the event of the CSRD hasn't really penetrated into mainstream business, but essentially what it is, it's a new suite of reporting requirements for businesses within the EU. Now there's a scope, so you have to be a certain size of organization, you have to have a certain turnover, so it won't capture SMEs, for example, but it
Okay.
certainly might capture, bigger hotel chains that have higher turnovers and higher numbers of staff. And essentially, it's a suite of standards, a directive covering various different environmental topics around environment, climate, biodiversity, water, those kinds of things, and a very prescriptive suite of criteria under which you have to report. And to accompany the CSRD, there has been the development of a suite of reporting standards called the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And there is a reporting standard attached to each of those different sort of pillars, if you like. So there's a very
Okay.
specific one around biodiversity and ecosystems. There's a very specific one around water, and very specific one around climate. So all in all, there's 5 of those ESRS standards around environment. And I guess it's important for businesses to know and hotels to know that, number one, whether or not you're in scope for reporting, which you can find out by looking up CSRD online. There's lots of different bodies giving advice on how to report and who needs to be reporting. But more than that, if you're an SME sitting within the value chain of an organization which is reporting under CSRD, you will be expected to comply to a certain degree. So as well as the ESRS reporting standards, there's also voluntary reporting standards, which I believe are still in draft mode at the moment. But for those organizations who want to be compliant, sitting in a value chain, and there's a voluntary standard reporting standard available as well. So there's so much happening in this space. Even as somebody who's immersed in this space all the time, I'm finding the pace of change is really, really huge for people that are working directly in the space, but also businesses that are affected.
Mm.
We also have the EU deforestation regulation, which is coming into force in December. Again, people don't know about that, and it's essentially we're trying to get more transparency in value chains and to ensure that companies working within the EU are using value chains that don't result in deforestation elsewhere in the world. So again, it's an amping up of transparency and putting more responsibility on business owners to really understand what is happening in their value chain and how can they influence what's happening at that stage of their business as well.
Wow, that's a lot that's coming down for us. Okay, well, for businesses. So thank you for that introduction. I don't think we need to necessarily then go into the scope. I mean, as you say, people can check CSRD online. Um, what, just give us an idea when you say SMEs, just give us a ballpark figure, Lucy, of who it applies to and who it doesn't apply to. What sort of size of business?
Yeah, it's large organizations that typically have more than 500 people that have
Okay.
a balance sheet of over, 40 million, that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
it's much larger organizations, kind of corporates. I mean, it is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, so it does
Mm.
apply to corporates operating within the EU. So anyone who is familiar with the non-financial reporting directive, that's NFRD, if you had to report against that previously, you will be in scope for CSRD automatically. And then as the years progress, so we're having more and more businesses reporting year on year. And so if you're a listed SME, if you're an SME listed on the stock exchange, you will be expected to be reporting in 2027. So you've got a big lead in time in terms of preparation for CSRD reporting. Now, the other thing I would say is that CSRD is really a tool for businesses. It hasn't been designed to be a stick to beat people with.
Mm.
It's really a mechanism to ensure that sustainability becomes embedded in business thinking, in decision making, in business models. And it's about changing and evolving businesses towards a more sustainable mode of operation. And in the space that I work in, we talk about a nature positive mode of working. So it's ensuring that your business activities are enhancing and restoring nature rather than destroying and degrading nature.
Mm.
So we need to look at CSRD as a tool to help us build resilient business models and not necessarily as a whipping stick for business, because that's really not what it is. It is
Yeah.
there to support us and help us to evolve into a better, more sustainable operating mode that's working within those planetary boundaries, if that's something that you've heard of before.
Yeah.
I'm
So
introducing all this new stuff.
no, no, yeah. And just to be clear, this only applies to the EU at the moment, yeah?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a non-EU company with an EU operation, you like a big American corporate or something that
Mm.
has a HQ here in Ireland, or anywhere else in the EU, you will be expected to report, but not until 2027.
Okay. So this, yeah, as you say, applies to corporate businesses essentially at the moment. I imagine it might roll out to SMEs at some point
Mm,
in the future, but there's no point conjecturing about that. I think what's interesting from our point of view, Arrow, we 99% of our business is with hotels, and a good chunk of that is with hotels in Ireland. What's interesting is hotels are very different to a lot of businesses that might operate out of a tower block or a trading estate. They tend to have grounds.
mm,
They're often set in tens or hundreds of acres. And a lot of people, a lot of tourists come to Ireland for the landscape, for the way the country is. You get Americans coming here from the Midwest saying, "Oh, I can't believe how green it is in Ireland." I mean that's I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true.
it's our brand.
Yeah, it is
Mm,
part of the brand for sure. Yeah, and Falkshire Island play on that, and the Wild Atlantic Way plays on that. So it seems to me that hotels, and there will be some hotels that fall into the scope.
mm,
We have some hotels that would have 500 employees, I'm sure, and the kind of turnover that you mentioned. It seems to me that those hotels are actually uniquely placed, maybe in terms of businesses, to have a really positive impact. They should see it as a benefit, not just an exercise in box ticking
mm.
or more paperwork for them to fill in. Do you think that's a fair way of looking at it, Lucy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk a lot about biodiversity is not a constraint. It is an opportunity, as you say, to deliver broader systemic value. And you've touched on something really important there, Richard, in terms of the how our travel and tourism industry is really built on the beautiful landscape that we have here in Ireland. And we talk about, so the work that I'm doing around being nature positive, what we're asking businesses to do and what CSRD will ask businesses to do is to start assessing their impacts and their dependencies on the natural world. We're all completely dependent on the natural world. As a species, we're part of the biosphere, we're not separate from it. And our
Mm.
whole economy is underpinned by nature. So if you think about it from the hotel's perspective, we have a really we talk about ecosystem services, right? That's all of the services that nature delivers to us. So it's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, it's the food and textiles and all those things, that are part of the hotel value chain, particularly, food. And if you look at your linens and your furniture, like all of that supply chain, that's all underpinned by nature.
Mm.
And so we need to understand what are the risks associated with nature no longer being able to provide us with these ecosystem services, or a risk to supply of linens, or a risk to supply of furniture because there's ecosystem degradation happening and there's a deterioration in soil health, for example, and we're no
Right.
longer able to grow linen and cotton. And so we look at those ecosystem services and those dependencies on nature. And the big one there for travel and tourism is what we call, the sort of recreation and ecotourism, the aesthetic value, the intrinsic value of nature. And we haven't put a monetary value on it, or if you can argue that we have, and that value is zero. So we need to figure out what is the financial benefit that we're getting from being sited in a beautiful place,
Right.
because that ultimately affects our bottom line. How beautiful, how healthy, how robust are the ecosystems that surround our business, and how are they contributing to our business success? So it's taking things to another level beyond traditional financial accounting, and it's looking at accounting for the benefits that we're getting from our natural surroundings. So other types of benefits, as I mentioned already, food and raw materials, in some cases medicines, fresh water, but also nature provides air quality regulation, climate regulation, recycling, composting. It manages our nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon cycles, all of those lovely things that happen despite us, but that we completely rely on. We've evolved alongside and we are completely dependent on.
Gosh, that's a lot to take in. Because you might think as a hotel logistics manager, maybe you'd think, oh, how can we reduce our reliance on single-use plastic, by not having by having refillable soap and conditioner in the room, or maybe not giving a guest a paper receipt at
Mm,
checkout. But you're talking next level stuff here, Lucy, about
yes.
looking at your position on, I don't know, the Ring of Kerry or the Wild Atlantic Way or the north coast of Northern Ireland, and valuing or being able to attribute some value to where you're positioned in nature.
Mm.
How I wouldn't even know where to start. So give us a clue.
So there's a very new branch of science emerging now called natural capital accounting. And
Okay.
that's essentially looking at how do we value things like that. So how are we valuing our dependency on healthy soils, or how are we valuing, that intrinsic, natural aesthetic beauty in which our business kind of depends on. But I think you said there, Richard, it is the conversation around biodiversity has moved on significantly. It hasn't quite percolated down to mainstream thinking, or dinner table conversation, but
Hmm.
certainly people are more aware of the biodiversity crisis and what needs to happen. So in the context of business, it's really now, as I said, important for organizations to understand how their business is impacting nature. So how much land are you occupying? How are you managing that land? What is happening within that value chain? So having full visibility on where you're sourcing things, like, and you need to start being able to trace things back to farm level, because ultimately that's where the impact is going to be happening in the biosphere, and probably not happening in Ireland. So we're externalizing a lot of our ecological impact to other parts of the world, to India or Egypt where they're growing the cotton, understanding what's happening at that part of the value chain. So it becomes very strategic. And then, so a good nature strategy for an organization looks at both on-site, ecological habitat support, but also, what else is happening in terms of my business model, what else is happening in terms of those value chains. And we're not expecting for people to have access to that information that like straight away. This is something that's going to evolve over time. I think there's going to be a big grace period in terms of reporting against these things in terms of like CSRD, simply because there is a big delta there in terms of the data that's needed and what data is available. So I think there's going to be a lot of investment towards building up those data sources for businesses to be able to use them and be transparent and know exactly what impacts they're having across their value chain. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting phase of change. Many of the listeners may not have heard of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed in Montreal in 2022, which is essentially like the Paris Agreement for nature. So the Paris Agreement had 1.5 degrees limiting global warming. That was the key thing for Paris in 2015. And in Montreal, the Global Biodiversity Framework it developed 23 targets around biodiversity that are basically sort of that North Star for all jurisdictions, and they're hoping that those targets were agreed by 169 countries, that they'll be transposed into law at some point. And so we're seeing things like that happening now with the EU and the nature restoration law. But their sort of flagship target for the Global Biodiversity Framework, now called the Biodiversity Plan for Life on Earth, they kind of rebranded it, is to protect 30% of our land and seas by 2030. So they're calling it the 30 by 30. Okay. And so then we need to look to ourselves as in the hotel business, how can we start contributing to those kinds of goals? So even if it's SDGs or if it's the Global Biodiversity Framework, like even a very simple thing that you could do is, looking at your land footprint, can I give 30% of my land footprint back to nature? So not mowing lawns. I mean, artificial grass is one of the absolute worst things that you can do for biodiversity and soil health. So, removing things like that and having permeable, it's not sealing the soil, having permeable,
not hard surfaces.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and so making sure that the soil can breathe and water has somewhere to go, proper water management, things like rain gardens can help reduce the amount of pollution that goes into our groundwater. And yeah, just beehives are not a great idea. They're grand if you're producing honey, but they're not a biodiversity or ESG measure. In fact, sometimes you'll find, and this is happening, we see with a lot of corporate offices in London, which are throwing up beehives on roofs all over the place in London city centre, and there's no forage for these bees. So ultimately, honeybees, and I just want to say, honeybees are not threatened. It's the 99% of there are wild bees that are threatened. So honeybees are a domesticated, managed species, and they're not threatened at all. So when you put hives in all over the place and you bring honeybees into a place where perhaps they weren't occurring naturally, you've got this massive amount of competition, which compounds the issues we have around the survival of our wild bumblebee species. So I think a lot of people have opted to do things like that, and I'm not casting any shadows over that. I think they were doing the things that they were advised to do and what appeared to be best practice at the time. But now, as the conversation has moved on, so we're looking at doing different types of measures for biodiversity to see, how can we manage our business better for biodiversity? How can we reduce the amount of waste that we're producing, which of course has always been viewed as a sustainability thing, but actually it's a biodiversity thing. You might have heard of the IPCC, which is that climate change people, they release this report every year. So it's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Climate Change. And they release this IPCC report, which has all the really scary climate data. There is an equivalent for biodiversity, and they're called IPBES. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they, in 2019, they released the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss globally. And for all businesses and hotel businesses, it's worth looking at these to see how is my organization contributing to them. And those 5 drivers of biodiversity loss are pollution. So how much pollution are you generating, whether it's solid, liquid, or gaseous pollution? It is invasive species. So do you have invasive species on your land, like Japanese knotweed or winter heliotrope, and actively managing those invasive species? Also things like rhododendron and cherry laurel, they're all quite destructive in terms of the impact they have on our native species. Climate change and biodiversity, they are 2 sides of the same coin. Climate change increases the rate of biodiversity loss. The loss of biodiversity loss compounds the climate change situation. So if you think about, the climate is getting hotter and we have forest fires and it wipes out a whole forest ecosystem, which causes biodiversity loss. And then that forest ecosystem is not there anymore to sequester carbon. So it's those things are circling the drain together. The third one is changing the way we use our land. So it's technically called ecosystem conversion, but it's converting so going from a wild space like a species-rich grassland or a forest, and then changing it into agricultural land or developing it for building. So understanding that element. And the final thing is the direct and over exploitation of natural resources. So that includes the amount of water that you're using, the impact that has on biodiversity, but also the social impact that has on the communities, perhaps not in a country like Ireland where we're not water stressed, but in other parts of the world, perhaps something in your value chain is contributing to water stress. But also overfishing is a big problem. So responsibly sourced fish, if that's even a thing, if people can say that fish is now responsibly sourced, all of those types of things, they're all contributors to biodiversity loss. And how can we assess how our business is contributing to those?
Wow, yeah, this is huge, and it's so interesting. And I know that a lot of our listeners are not from Ireland, and I'm not trying to make this particularly Irish centric, but I think an important when a subject is so big, you have to get down to some specifics really to try and show people, where some of the highlight the personal, I suppose, in some of the areas. And just I mean, while you were talking there, and I was just kind of laughing to myself because for the last 3 years I've tried to grow a wildflower garden outside in our lawn and have failed miserably so far. And certainly the first 2 years it was because I was planting things that were not actually designed to be planted in what is essentially bogland in Connemara, which is where we live on the west coast of Ireland. So yeah, I'm learning and moving on. I think let's look at some things that apply to all hotels, not just to hotels in Ireland. I mean, we deal mainly with luxury hotels, Lucy. Let's, some of the things that are associated with luxury hotels, spas, for example, a lot of water use with swimming pools, golf courses, demanding guests. People come and want their, salmon, they want their oysters, they want their asparagus. It's only in season for 5 weeks of the year in Ireland. How, and I really want to frame this conversation as how hotels can see these new regulations, requirements as a benefit. They should be not thinking, oh, this is just greenwashing. I actually want to project our hotel and make a positive impact. So how do you square that circle of the luxury hotel providing these facilities, which that in part is what people come for, but also doing what you're talking about in terms of biodiversity?
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things there. I mean, the first thing I would say, and this is a big stretch, is having, I suppose, showing leadership. So, and that ultimately translates to courage. So actually having the courage and the leadership to say, for example, that, and maybe putting some rationale or caveats around it, like we are only serving in season food. And, I think a lot of people are, so if, you know, the customer is always right and the customer is king and we have to do everything and provide everything and go the extra mile. And I think that's really important because, I mean, I like going to a luxury hotel as much as the next person, but it doesn't happen too often. But, you know, it's definitely, I think, one of those things where somebody has to take the leading step in this
Mm,
transformation and starts being able to say, actually, no, this is not, it's not possible to have asparagus in December, or,
mm,
you know, it's not possible to get blueberries because they have to come from South Africa. You know, so I think it's the courage to be able to make those changes and to stand your ground and to say, we have a very strong ethical reason for wanting to do this and wanting to change the way our business operates. Um, a lot of people might think that's not realistic, but you know, if you can, I mean, that's the thing. It's about breaking the thinking patterns. It's about
mm.
changing the way we think. It's about behavioral change. And already we see, I often see in hotels, you know, if you want to reuse your towels, then, you know, you reduce water consumption and everything,
Yeah.
which is fantastic for the environment, but it also saves the hotel a lot of money, you
Mm,
know, in terms of not using resources that they don't need to use. Like people
mm.
don't need fresh towels every day. So that's just a step in the right direction in terms of potential benefits that can be had by applying a nature positive sustainability approach. And again, I think just to say, you know, nature positive biodiversity, it's not an additional thing. It has to be embedded and woven into
Yeah.
your sustainability thinking. It's not another thing you need to do. Like it is a core, the nature positive approach is a core path, and it will help you deliver on your climate and nature objectives. So just to kind of put that in there as well. But I think the overall biodiversity loss represents a huge risk to business, a huge risk to business. And I think the more that you understand what those risks are in the context of your own organization and your own industry, the more you'll start to understand what the benefits of acting now for nature protection and stewardship, the benefits that will have to your business in the long term. You'll begin to realize that. And dealing with these things now will be much more cost effective than trying to fix things in the future and trying to remediate the damage that's been done. We have time to do it. We know what we need to do. We need a lot of businesses to mobilize now, so we start gaining the bit of experience, gaining momentum, creating those visionary leaders that we need in this space that will help drive things forward.
It's an interesting clash of areas, and maybe clash is the wrong word, an interesting mix of areas, Lucy, that we, you know, it's science, it's nature, it's business, but it's accounting as well, isn't it? You know,
Yes.
what a fascinating mix of areas that has to, you know, ultimately out of this, we want progress. Are there going to be are there any incentives for businesses to you know, prove that they actually are interested and taking action on biodiversity? And I don't just mean things like carbon offsetting, you know, which I think is pretty much discredited these days. Again, you know, look, Business for Biodiversity in Ireland. So let's start with Ireland. You know, is there any incentives for businesses, hoteliers to do anything right now?
Well, incentives, not so much, but there is a huge amount of grant funding available for organizations to start looking at their sustainability, particularly for SMEs. So if you do have fewer than 50 people working in your business, you can access various different grants through your local authority, your local enterprise office, and through Enterprise Ireland if you are a member of Enterprise Ireland. So there's lots of things like climate action vouchers and the Green Start Fund, which will give you access to consultants to help you get started on your own sustainability journey, or indeed your own nature positive journey. I don't want to separate those two things. They're sort of one and the same. So there's lots in terms of financial supports, and then in terms of training. So like I'm a big believer in building internal capacity within an organization, like sustainability, nature, all of those things, they have to be embedded within the core of the organization, in the same way that we embed health and safety, in the same way that we embed quality. Sustainability has to become a cog in the machine of the business, and it has to be properly resourced. So I think it's really important that we're able to build internal capacity so that we're not constantly farming this out to consultants, in which case we don't get to intimately understand the processes, we don't know how to manage it and maintain it and take it forward, because we've farmed out that knowledge. So you want to bring that knowledge in-house. That's the first thing. So in terms of so there's a UK equivalent for any UK listeners. That's a UK Business and Biodiversity Forum. Are there any other countries that your listeners might be sitting?
Yeah, look, I mean, we have clients worldwide, but yeah, I mean, the majority would be UK and Ireland. But, we have clients in America, France, Germany, Far East. Yeah. So, I mean, you're probably not best placed to comment on those more far-flung areas, but, as ever, an online search, I'm sure, would throw it up.
There's lots of, and the reason why I ask is, my involvement with the EU Commission's Business and Biodiversity platform means that the national platforms come together to discuss, a path forward for the EU. And there are other national platforms in operation in Germany and France and some of the other countries you mentioned there. So there is support available. In the UK, the SME Climate Hub is really, really good in terms of delivering useful sustainability guidance. Here in Ireland, we have the Climate Toolkit for Business. And of course, the platform that I work with is Business for Biodiversity Ireland, and we're helping businesses, guiding them through the process of creating a credible nature strategy. So in the coming weeks, we're going to be launching our new, our 4 progress tracks, which will take you from entry point and understanding how and where your business depends on nature, understanding what the sectoral context is, how does your sector contribute to nature degradation, and moving through the different processes of impacts and dependencies assessment, double materiality assessment, creating a nature strategy, setting a nature ambition, and then monitoring, evaluating, and evolving your business model to one that's more robust and that will ensure that your business is resilient in the face of climate and biodiversity loss shocks, which we are starting to see already.
Yeah. And, everybody in Ireland has been moaning about how bad the summer has been. And of course, hotels are very weather dependent. Well, there's a reason why the weather is like it is. I think we've all realized that by now. One thing that has just struck me actually, Lucy, and I think this is really an important thing to say actually, because when COVID came, hotels adapted amazingly quickly to what they had to do to keep business coming through the doors for COVID. I mean, we were part of that in terms of pivoting hotels business from, a lot of international travelers to county-wide and then countrywide guests. And I think if hotels had been told 2 years before, you have to implement all these hygiene rules, all this paperwork, the way people check in, that have thrown their hands up in horror and said, absolutely no way, it's a huge cost to business, we're not doing it. They implemented it within a matter of weeks because it was an emergency, and that I think is worth pointing out in terms of what you're talking about in biodiversity. If the will is there, then it can be done, can't it?
Absolutely. And, I think COVID is a really great example of that, of how we can mobilize and achieve, amazing things in a very short time. The funny thing is that in Ireland here in 2019, our government declared a biodiversity emergency. That's the terminology that they used.
I think they were the first country in the world. They were
the first.
So.
Yes, absolutely. A biodiversity emergency. And I mean, the use of that language, it's quite alarmist and everything else. But we haven't seen the same level of mobilization that we did for COVID. Now, I understand COVID was a life and death situation. It was very acute, whereas the biodiversity crisis is, it's really about what we're handing on to the next generation. Now, that being said, we are also seeing loss of revenue, economic downturn, sometimes loss of life because of the impacts and shocks of climate change. We are already seeing that, and yet, we're, these extreme temperatures and extreme weather events, we're seeing that the waters are lapping at the door, and yet there's still, broadly speaking, a lack of general engagement across the climate and biodiversity issues. So, but I actually feel like there's a bit of a sea change happening at the moment. I feel the momentum is building. I feel like people are starting to get it and starting to, nature is quite different in terms of how we talk about it. When you talk about climate, it's things that are happening in other parts of the world, perhaps not happening in the UK and Ireland. Um, we're talking about carbon, one molecule, it's very measurable. We've been talking about it for years, but it's quite technical. It's about measuring carbon emissions. But when we talk about nature, it's an emotive thing. People feel connected to nature, especially after COVID. COVID was almost like this catalyst for people kind of taking a moment and realizing, like access to nature is so important for us, for our mental health and our well-being. And I think everybody has a personal connection to nature, even a connection that goes all the way back into their childhood, that they rely on being outside in a natural space. We know it's good for our mental health. We know spending time in a green environment is good for us. And so nature has a different place in the sustainability conversation. It can mobilize people in a different way that climate or reducing single-use plastic or any of those things. It elicits a different kind of emotional response. And I'm beginning to see that happening now, that people are witnessing the degradation and the deterioration of ecosystems, and forests being, forest fires, and what happened in Middleton this time last year with that massive amount of economic loss. And it was just huge and devastating for the area, and that's as a result of many things, but one of which being climate change. So I think it's important to note the differences between nature and climate change, but also how interconnected they are, and how if we tackle one, we'll solve a lot of the other issues as well, including the social justice issues as well. Excuse me. It's all connected.
Yeah, and it goes back to what I said about the mix of disciplines that this involves, and it seems to me that accountants, should be putting nature on the balance sheet almost.
Yeah.
And like you say, if there was a flood or a fire that wiped out a forest that was near them, and was one of the reasons why people came to the hotel, then it's a negative on the balance sheet.
Yeah.
If they increase the size of that forest, it's a positive. It's not for me to say how they monetize that, but that's their job. But it seems to me very clear that that's how it should work. Yeah. And just to wrap up, Lucy, one thing that I wanted to say about hotels is that, unlike, I suppose, a lot of corporates where people can work remotely, they still rely on a lot of bodies in the hotel. And those people would generally come from the community around the hotel. I think hotels are almost unique in that, because somebody who makes the beds or is a chef in a hotel can't work remotely, plainly. So this harks back to what you said about empowering people within the organization to make the change rather than using external consultants. Wouldn't it be great, to empower the people to say, look, this is how we've always done it, but it doesn't have to be the way that we always do it in the future. The gardener, you don't have to use these weed killers, or you can get your water for the golf course by collecting rainwater rather than using treated water from a hose pipe. You can ask the people who clean the rooms, how could we do this more efficiently? Isn't that a real opportunity for hotels in particular to drive the kind of work that you're talking about?
Absolutely. I think engagement across the whole organization is hugely important, because people will drive that for you if you can engage them properly and educate them and make them feel part of the solution. And I think more than that, most individuals want to work with with a company that has strong ethics, that has strong, social and environmental values. And I think that was the output of a recent PwC study where, by 2030, half of the workforce are going to be millennial and Gen Z. So, and that cohort have really strong values in terms of environment, climate, social justice. So you as an organization need to move with those times if you're to attract and retain that kind of talent. So that's another benefit, I suppose, with engaging with the nature positive approach and with engaging with sustainability issues, is that the people that will be working for you in 5 or 10 years will only want to work with organizations that they know are not contributing to climate change and are not destroying the environment.
Yeah, and look, I may be over egging the pudding here, but it is interesting. I have children who are Gen Zers, and the things that, well, I'm quite old myself now, but the things that I put up with when I was young, they throw their hands up in horror. They're like, how could you have accepted that in the workplace? But that's how it was. And you can imagine somebody being taken on as a manager of the cleaning services, or as I say, the head of gardening or whatever, who has come through those value systems that you're talking about and going, well, that's just not acceptable. That's as bad as racism or sexism or whatever. That is, you're actively destroying what you have here. And I think that's a really interesting point, that there is a potentially a future shock there for particularly corporations, who just expect everybody to behave the same. They always, don't they? That's the way corporations like status quo. They don't want change.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I think people's values are changing, as you said, and the baseline norms are shifting. What's acceptable now may not be acceptable in years to come. I recently rewatched Friends, the series, and there's things that they say and do in that show that you just would never get away with now. So just as an example, it's quite iconic for that particular era in the 90s, and just how much things have changed. And the same thing is happening in business. Those shifting baselines, the norms are changing now, and people need to be able to keep up with those shifting baselines.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's a really positive way to end, because it's not just about the us relying on corporations to do stuff which we know they're probably not going to want to do, but ultimately, and look, this podcast is about hotels. Ultimately, hotels are about people, and those people generally come from a community, and if they can see that what they're doing benefits the hotel and the community that they come from and their children and their peers, then I think maybe this will actually go better than we think it's going to go, or maybe it will be a little bit easier than we think it's going to be. So yeah, I just want to end on a positive note, Lucy.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of hope for how things are going. I can see the changes that are happening in industry. I can see the number of people that are now moving into sustainable business in terms of consulting and advice, and lots and lots of passionate people are working in this space. So there's a huge amount of momentum. There's a huge amount of change happening, whether it's, values change, systemic change, regulatory change. The change is happening. So don't get left behind.
Great. Thank you very much. I have learnt a lot today, and I hope our listeners have too. There was a lot of directives and regulations we talked about at the beginning. I will put links to them in the podcast blurb, make it easy for people to go and educate themselves. Really, I think that's the key, Lucy, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, ignorance of the pending regulations is not an excuse, and there will be penalties for businesses that don't comply.
Okay, good. Well, you've been warned. Lucy Gaffney, thank you very much. And I would hopefully we could do a part 2 actually in a year or so and see how things have moved on. Wouldn't that be interesting?
Absolutely, be delighted.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you, Richard.
Wow, that was brilliant. Absolutely amazing.
I hope I didn't bamboozle you too much.
No, not at all. I come from a scientific background, so I'm kind of used to having talking kind of those kind of things. But I think it was a lovely mix of yeah, some regulatory stuff, some personal stuff. Yeah, the community stuff I think is important. Relating it to actual local events,
Mm,
happenings. Yeah, it's it's difficult to appeal to a massive, wide audience in all
yeah.
parts of the world, and I think most of our
And
listeners probably are from Ireland, to be fair.
yeah, the
Yeah.
thing about it is like we still don't have all of the answers, you know.
Mm,
We have a lot of the theory, and so we still don't know exactly what a truly sustainable, truly nature positive hotel looks like.
mm.
But we need some people to take those steps forward
Yeah.
to start trying to get there, you
Yeah.
know. So it's about motivating people to make those changes and to start thinking differently.
Yeah, and hoteliers are notoriously conservative, and
Mm,
I can't really be saying that on a podcast because these are our clients.
yeah.
Um, but I just it hugely frustrates me. I look, when they tried to bring in the new regulations about burning turf, I mean the shit show that was, and
Mm,
the government were backpedaling, and it was just a mess. The whole thing was just a mess. And I get, that turf burning is a huge part of Irish culture, but it's
mm,
also an absolute climate disaster.
yeah, it is on
And
multiple levels.
yeah, on so
Yeah.
many levels, yeah. And
Mm,
I come from Yorkshire originally, which is very peat rich, and they're actually re-wetting the peatlands in
mm,
Yorkshire. They drained them all, and now they're re-wetting them because they
mm,
realise how important they are, and we're bloody digging them up.
yeah.
And people come to hotels, they do, Lucy, and they go, "Oh, I love the smell of a turf fire," and it's like,
Yeah.
but do you realise what this is doing?
Yeah. I mean, I love it myself because I have
I know
memories
it's a
associated
very
with it.
evocative smell, yeah.
It is absolutely. Yeah. And that's, but perhaps there's a way that we can use, like we talked there about people being connected to nature. Like people often have memories of smells or sounds or
Mm,
something that from their childhood that connects them to nature, and
mm.
whether it might be burning turf, maybe that's the thing, but like it's ingrained within us, to have that connection to our environment, the natural world. So hopefully we can use that to our advantage as well in
Yeah,
terms
that's
of
true. Yeah. Mm,
mobilizing people
mm.
and changing behavior. But like, yeah, it's like the key thing is, and as I said in the earlier, like it's about um people having the courage to
Yeah.
change the way they're doing things and having the courage to say, actually, no, we can't provide that for you because it's not sustainable. So it goes against our sustainability ethics.
Mm.
Um, and people kind of balk at the idea of, oh no, we couldn't say no to somebody, when
Yes.
like because people will complain or they might write a bad review about us or whatever. So yeah, it's about balance there, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. I've written those words down. I'm gonna use those words in the description. Bold, but being bold and being courageous. Yeah.
Yeah,
And there will be short-term pain. I'm sure, Americans will come over and they'll be horrified that, that they can't get asparagus
yeah,
or blueberries
yeah,
as we talked about. But there are alternatives. Be imaginative. I think imaginative
exactly.
is a good word as well, isn't it?
Be
Yeah.
imaginative, and like sustainability, it's not a buzzword. It has to be at the
Mm,
core of your business model. And in order for you to be sustainable, you have to make certain decisions. And that's what we're all about, is bringing nature and sustainability into your decision making. Is this a sustainable thing to do? And then
yeah.
if your clientele don't like it, it's kind of like, this is our brand. We
Yes.
are
Yeah.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
sustainable organization, and that's what's going to ensure that we're able to continue to operate well into the future because
Mm,
we're operating within
mm.
and within sustainable ways. And that's the change of thinking that needs to happen. But you're breaking down that traditionalist, the conservative, you know, the long legacy of hoteling in Ireland. There's a lot of stuff to break down there. But we're not expecting it to happen overnight. It's a transition.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And that, is definitely a balance that, we have to strike that as a business, selling
Mm,
websites to hotels, I mean, they are incredibly stuck in their ways.
they are. And actually, I don't know if you've come across this, Richard, but we have this it's a website accreditation. It's called the Climate Positive website.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I'm
it might
gonna
be a
hop on
nice
that.
thing
Yeah.
to, yeah, it's a Climate Positive website. It's a small fee, but it basically optimizes your website to ensure that you're having minimal emissions from your website. But as a developer of websites, it might be a nice little, we have it on our website.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, just to kind of a little extra thing you can do. That's the bit that you can do maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's fair.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fair enough because I mean, we make a big thing about using AI as part of our strategy for hotels, but I know that AI is a massive problem environmentally in terms of the amount of energy that's required
Yeah.
for the server centers to deliver your chat GPT. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, you're right. We need to look at our own house as well, Lucy, for
Yeah.
sure.
It is. Yeah. No, that's what I always say to people as well. People that are offering sustainability services, they should have their own very strong
Yeah,
sustainability strategy as well.
absolutely.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's like, what's the point? Anyway, that was fun. Thanks for the
It was, and
invitation.
thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you. It was lovely to
Yeah.
talk to you.
No worries.
Okay,
Lovely to meet
thanks,
you too,
Lucy.
Richard.
Have a good
Cheers.
day.
Bye.
Bye bye.